So I'm delighted to introduce our very own research associate, Dr. Safet HadžiMuhamedović. Safet joined us at CIP as a research associate in interfaith relations in January 2020, I think it was. It feels longer than that, but I suppose it's been one of those years. And Safet previously taught at SOAS, at Bristol, and at Frankfurt, and also at Goldsmiths. He was here in Cambridge 10 years or so earlier for an MPhil in social anthropology, before then moving to Goldsmiths in the University of London for his doctorate. He's the author of the book Waiting for Elijah, Time and Encounter in a Bosnian Landscape, which came out with Bergan in 2018, and the co-editor of a collection of essays entitled Post-Home, Dwelling on Loss, Belonging and Movement. And he's currently working on syncretic cosmologies, nationalism and subterranean rivers in South Bosnia. So I think we might hear a little bit about each of those today. Safet is going to speak for 40 to 45 minutes, I think. I shan't cut him off if he goes much over that, but and then we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion, and I'll explain when we get there how that's going to work. Hopefully it will work. So please, Safet. Oh, sorry, I should introduce your papers. Spatio-Temporal Proximities, Bosnian Dinaric Karst after Unhoming Ruptures.
Thank you so much, Giles. Thank you, everybody, for coming to listen to my talk. I should specifically thank Giles for being the driving genius behind the CIP research seminars, which I've very much enjoyed, and we have some exciting plans to come. Let me just try to share my screen for a second. Let's see here. So I was originally going to greet you all with a good afternoon, but then I remembered that we're likely crossing a few time zones for this meeting, and because my talk today is on space, time, and encounter, it might be worth considering the space and time of our encounter today. We used to have these seminars in the Lightfoot room on the first floor of the Faculty of Divinity. And here in this image, you see Giles at the helm, as per usual, in front of Mr. Lightfoot. And in this room, if the sun rays burst through the windows, we would draw the curtains if a speaker had a PowerPoint presentation. And after the lecture, the respondents' intervention, the Q&A session, we would all move downstairs into the Selvin room for refreshments, and we would continue our conversations there. It was like a little ritual, and I would keep my eye on the clock as I was going to catch the fast train home in time for dinner. The good old days, right? Now, these virtual meetings, it seems, flatten the spatial and temporal qualities of encounter, which is not all without its benefits. In some ways, it's certainly more egalitarian, and we try very hard to translate into this non-space of Zoom meeting some semblance of social touch, imagining the string of computer readable binary values for primary colors as a room we are all gathered in. As you know, Walter Benjamin sensed some of this in his famous essay in the 30s. He said, for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. Yet, he continued, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. Early photography, the first revolutionary form of reproduction, embraced portrait to counter the disappearance of what he called the aura of the original. And similarly, willy-nilly, freed from that Cambridge on-campus ritual, What anchors our Zoom encounter today is the ostensible here and now of the face and the human voice. And even if I can't see all of you right now, your faces are still there. They're still present, projected into the way that I address you, reminding me of the presence of your face comforts me, indicating to me that this is not a hopeless, solitary monologue. So there's always an encounter on the horizon of my words. And this is precisely what I want to talk to you about today, the ways in which the distemporalized post-war returnees held on to encounters to reconfigure the unwanted present. To do so, I will rely on my long-term ethnographic research in Bosnia and some of my photography. As Giles mentioned, these are sort of the two publications that perhaps best indicate some of the directions I will be taking today. If you want to read more on spatio-temporal discontinuities and unhoming ruptures, perhaps you can start there. But let us now continue with this exercise in imagination and travel to the wide karst field of Gatsko in the southeastern Bosnian highlands on the border with Montenegro, as you see here on the map. Nestled in the Dinaric Mountains, 1,000 meters above sea level, this landscape undergoes dramatic seasonal changes. For the better part of the year, this field is locked in stone. During the winter, it is so heavy that one of my interlocutors had to use improvised skis to go anywhere. The year I was there, a helicopter bringing supplies to cut off villages crashed and broke up into pieces. The year really had to be, the winter had to be sort of, there had to be plenty of food, there had to be plenty of herbal medicine, all the preparations, all the supplies had to be there to endure the winter, the wood for heating and so on. And half of these supplies needed to be preserved by Trifon Day or Tripundan on the 14th of February, which was considered to be the middle of winter. Even getting to school was difficult, as Osman, one of my interlocutors, remembered from his childhood. Mothers would give children newspapers and matches to ward off hungry wolves coming down from the forests. Most social interaction would cease and the livestock were confined to the stables. There was one type of winter get-together, however, called siela, literally sit-ins. And the way you're imagining this landscape in my narrative now, so the Gatsko villagers would gather and traditionally tell stories and sing about their landscape. The fairies, the nymphs, the dragons that dwell therein, the epic heroes and their adventures, the mysteries of the karst, underground caves, sinkholes, and rivers. These gatherings were also temporally oriented towards the warm part of the year. The prospect of the end of the winter lockdown and encounter was always on the horizon of the Gatsko cyclical calendar. Their waiting was in expectation of the certainty of the seasons. Now, imagine this landscape starting to change, to wake up from the frost. There is a complete transformation of both the land and social activity. In the sacral calendar of the field, the 7th of April saw the first important shared ritual, Blagoviest, literally glad tidings. This is the feast of Annunciation, according to the Julian calendar, marked by Muslims and Christians alike. The uncertain horizon begins to melt and the earth reveals its humane form. To mark this change, children from all the villages would seek out the highest hilltops and light tall bonfires around the field in the evening. Their flames, breaking into the dark, abstract space and communicating with each other, signaled a shared approach to the landscape. The meaning of Blagoviest may be drawn from a local proverb, the Annunciation and the cattle into gluttony, or in another version, the Annunciation, glad tidings, the cattle into gluttony, and the shepherds into coma. Children herding the animals to pasture would sing this rhyme. Their mothers would knit them woolen bags and load them with food to last the entire day. Spring's entry into full swing on 6th of May, according to the Julian calendar, was marked by Đurđevdan, or Jurjeva, George's Day. This is a pan-Bosnian festival celebrated by Christians, Muslims, and Roma of different sort of religious denominations, but it also exists in various forms, sometimes under different names, throughout the world of springtimes, particularly in the Mediterranean region. It focuses on movement, particularly female sexuality, rejuvenation, birth, potency, children. At the wake of dawn, before the day is set, young women would go to river rapids or water mills where they would disrobe and proceed to wash themselves with omaha, the magical water that brings health and prosperity. Young men would wake up early to watch the ritual from safe distance, whilst the girls attempted to hide. In some places, on the eve of George's Day, the girls decorate their houses with miloduh, the hyssop blossom. Miloduh literally translates as kind spirit. As the evening falls, young men sneak up to houses of the girls to steal or scatter the hyssop blossoms. The girls who know, or at least hope this will happen, then pretend to be angry and complain about the loss of their virginal flowers. Young women are pushed high into the air on swings tied to large trees, especially oaks. They plant nettle in front of their houses or in the manure close to the farm sheds. And from these leaves, they unriddle the direction of marriage proposals to come. Married women lash themselves with withies of willow or cornel branches, hoping to get pregnant. And everyone ties red ribbons to branches of cornel with wishes for the health of their loved ones. Children run around stinging each other with nettles or lashing each other with cornel. And the cattle are fed a mixture of herbs for health. Non-humans in this space, especially for George's Day, are full of dangerous and mysterious agentive properties, and particularly visible in the springtime. Now, seasonal change also saw the arrival of the nomadic Gurbeti Roma communities to the landscape. Not actually people whom you see in this image, but this was actually taken in Visoko in central Bosnia. It's a Roma St. George's Day festival. But Gurbeti in southeastern Bosnia used to settle in the same places each spring. They worked at tinning copperware for the settled communities, generally receiving in return fresh farm produce or cooked food. Settled Christians and Muslims celebrated St. George's Day with the Gurbeti Roma. Eno, one of my interlocutors, described the landscape's longing. We knew everything about them, their every step. After a long winter, believe me, people longed for them just like they longed for spring. Just like when you wait for your exam dates or the way a feast is expected, so people waited for the gypsies. George's Day was another opportunity for kumovi to meet. Kumstvo is a particular institution of spiritual kinship similar to God-parenthood, which can be forged between two people, but then extends to the entire household. And it is understood as one of the most important social institutions, usually in the form of an old bond between these two families or households. And it really established a mutual dedication to care, protect, and a mutual affection between these two families. And because the relationship seems to have been inherited in perpetuity, some families did not know exactly when the originating ritual act took place. Proverbially, one's kum is closer than a brother. This spiritual kinship in Gatsko was never really formed between Muslim and another Muslim, or Christian and another Christian, but exclusively between Christians and Muslims, I was told. One of my interlocutors said it was a common approach and the greatest bond of friendship between Serbs and Muslims. Muslim women in the field would not cover their faces before Orthodox Christian men. As they said, with a kum, it was as if a member of your family was there. There was no hiding. Another closely related form of alternative interfaith kinship, very often interfaith, is activated by the exchange of milk through non-maternal nursing and the ritual exchange of blood. Now, the interfaith encounters of St. George's Day only marked the entry into the season of hard labor. Cattle herding, field work, jobs in the gigantic thermal power plant built by the socialist Yugoslav state in the 70s, they took up most of the summertime. And one last annual feast was required, a gathering par excellence, awaited and desired throughout the year, Elijah's Day on the 2nd of August, according to the Julian calendar again. Muslims call it Alijun, Serbs, Orthodox Christians, Ilindan. It is the turning point of the summer, marking the end of the harvest and the heavy workload. A ubiquitous saying in Bosnia, particularly in the field of Gatsko, goes, until noon, Ilija, afternoon, Alija. The distinction Ilija, Alija really lies in just one letter, as if to underscore the similarity and difference at the same time. Ilija, a very common traditional Christian name, and Alija, a very common traditional Muslim name in Bosnia, they epitomize the common person. The root of both names, Ali and Eli, means high or ascension. Ilija and Alija share their most important day in Gatsko equally, each getting a precise half, and the bond between them to which they ascend is noon, the sun at its peak. For Orthodox Christians, the day started with the morning prayer in the church of St. Elijah in the village of Nadanici, and Muslims gathered near the mosque in the village of Kula and the spring of Sopot for the noon prayer, after which there would be a sort of a mass gathering and celebration. The division morning and noon was suggested was pragmatic so that people could attend both festivities, and there certainly was a lot of mixing between the two celebrations. Now, I don't have time to go much into some of these sort of cosmological narratives and histories and connections, but St. George and St. Elijah merged the faces of Yarilo, the early Slavic deity of spring, Perun, the early Slavic deity of thunder, and Khidr, the green one of the Mediterranean traditions, along with various other cosmological characters. Investigating Levantine religiosities, Syrian historian Hassan Haddad grouped George, Khidr, and Elijah under the common denominator of Georgic saints, noting that their three main features in the Mediterranean are fertility, power, and continuity of life. I adopted this adjective Georgic not just to indicate a group of characters endowed with seasonal potency, but also to describe the kinds of landscape and syncretic systems to which they belong. So Elijah's Day is traditionally the culmination of the social calendar. As one of my interlocutors told me, everyone knew that the winter is approaching and that this feast was the final outlet for social interaction. There was an abundance of food and drink. Some enjoyed group singing and dancing, whilst others entered into athletic tournaments. Younger people flirted with each other, marriages were arranged, others sat in the shade and talked. Fistfights between groups of men were not uncommon either, although I didn't witness any during my fieldwork, but they came as a sort of ritual cleansing of emotions. All communication was condensed into this one day, which commemorated the social life of the community. Anne was not sure how best to describe to me what Elijah's Day is. He struggled with it as if suddenly required to describe something universally understandable, being born or walking. And he said, No matter whom you ask, no one will be able to give you a definition. It has always been celebrated. They will all mention some traditions or other. I have not been able to find it in any books. It's not in the Quran. It comes as an unwritten rule. It is a day that depicts one place of people. As soon as one Elijah's day ended, he said people would steer the entire year towards the next one, planning, waiting, dreaming of the next 2nd of August. Now, at this point, you're probably asking yourselves, how can this image of encounters and rituals be so idealized? Is Safet romanticizing some imagined past? What about the war, the unhoming ruptures, the exile that were mentioned earlier as part of my research experience and interests? So far, I have given you a very selective glimpse into the way in which life in the field of Gatsko was habitually narrated through a collective retreat into the idealized past of the place as a way of dealing with the unhomely present. Now, without the memoryscapes of my interlocutors, my experience of this landscape would have been dramatically different. If you just happened to pass through, what you would see would be a series of unwelcoming ruins, sitting in beautiful scenery to be true, yet still desolate. Like most other parts of Bosnia, Gatsko underwent a systematic ethno-religious cleansing in the 1990s. Its inhabitants had been murdered, raped, kept in concentration camps, all or partly recorded in ICTY testimonies. Their houses had been torched and packed with landmines. Their temples had been razed to the ground, debris of these temples buried in secret locations. Most of the Muslims, save for some elderly returnees, lived in exile. When I was there, all of the places where Gurbeti Roma used to dwell were uninhabited. Post-Yugoslav boundaries had been drawn across what used to be their nomadic paths. As their livelihood depended on the settled folk, Gurbeti migrated into towns where their primary modes of earning a living often became junk collection and begging. Gatsko was cleansed of those deemed to be non-Serbs and decorated with a nationalist assortment. In the town, everywhere I looked, on the walls of the hotel, houses, the cafes, there were graffiti glorifying men convicted for war crimes by the ICTY. I walked and read these marks on space. Šešelj is coming. Ratko is our hero. The handwriting seemed the same, as if one person spray painted them overnight. The central square in the town of Gatsko was adorned with new bronze statues of notable Serbs. Near a site where a mosque was razed to the ground in 1992, on the main intersection, a new church of the Holy Trinity has been erected. In appearance and size, it resembled none of the other older churches in Gatsko. Like many other post-war churches, it is, and not just across the region, but in diasporic worlds as well, it is a replanted image of Serb nationhood. It echoes the style of the medieval monastery of Gračanica in Kosovo. Kosovo continues to function as a place of great symbolic importance for Serb nationalism, primarily centered through the myths about the battle that took place on the field of Kosovo in 1389 between the Ottoman army and the Christian medieval crowns of the region. The introduction of Kosovo, of this symbolic language into Gatsko, thus projected a unified identity. A distinct nation was being forged through designated authentic materials from the past. In 2013, as part of a municipal project to beautify Gatsko, next to the church adorned, there was a graffiti that sort of adorned one of the walls, which said, "Kosovo, the soul of every Serb man." So the traditions of local Orthodox Christianity were also systematically subjected to pan-ethno-national unification. The Nationalist temporal project constructed histories and futures of ethnic suffering, always on the horizon and given as an ominous warning in the speeches of the clergy. The field of Gatsko was seeded with the very essence of the national abstraction. It was occupied with ordained dead bodies, which naturalize power and symbolize its loss and the need for it to be regained. The human body was equated with the national body. Mass graves were read through ethnic selection. So, for example, here you see a mass grave, a natural karst pit, just sort of in the field of Gatsko, which has three different names. It has some original name, it's Golubnjača, which means that it was a habitat for pigeons. And then it has two other names, which relate to the layers of bodies that were thrown into the pit. First of the Dizdar family, so it's called Dizdarusha, a Muslim family in the First World War, and then the Orthodox Christian inhabitants of the village of Korita, so it's named Korička Jama, in the Second World War. Now, the ways in which this place is commemorated now with clergy and politicians and even modules in history by local history professors commemorates one ethno-religious layer of these bodies, okay, kind of thrown into the pit. Now, my interlocutors seldom spoke about this kind of present and this kind of nationalist present. And their narratives were mostly filled with rich and visceral encounters of the past. So I kept traveling back and forth between these two temporally different places, temporally different realities. Facing such dissonance prompted me to ask again Roy Wagner's questions. Are there different kinds of time or merely different ways of counting time? Does time have a structure as a clock does, or does it merely seem to have a structure because a clock has one? I approach this as an ontological problem, shifting to understand how time is conceptualized in a specific context, rather than assuming a priori that I know its measure. What I soon realized is that the field of Gatsko lives between two grand time-space themes, or chronotopes, both idealized and in a life and death dispute with each other. Mikhail Bakhtin coined the term chronotope to indicate the indivisibility of spatial and temporal categories, admittedly only with regards to its function in literature. Time, he noted, thickens, takes on flesh, and space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. I employed chronotope as a heuristic device to think of these divergent social currents in the field, and really a chronotope is a discernible alliance of time and space, a time, as Bakhtin said, thickened in the landscape, and a set of practices and relationships, and the space articulated through a time of specific quality. Each chronotope has its own story, or rather each chronotope is a story. What I encountered were two salient overarching chronotopes as collective themes. Each relied on certain kinds of past and laid claims to the field's future. One was told through proximities, the other through distances between religious communities. Yet the main actors of the Gatsko collective themes of these chronotopes can and sometimes have to function within at least two contrasting chronotopes. So unlike Bakhtin's image of the literary image of a man who is always intrinsically chronotopic, I have thus argued that people and landscapes are sometimes trapped between discursive time spaces and thus schizochronotopic, from the Greek schizein, to split. So there's sort of a split, a rupture between these chronotopes, yet they're embodied in the same landscape, in the same body. The few elderly refugees who had returned spatially to their homes have not also returned temporally. It wasn't home. That place could not be home because space is temporally inflected. The rhythms, durations, sequences, and expectations of home were in the past, possibly also in the future, but not in the present. Regained spatial coordinates could not make up for the fact that the temporal orientations of communal life had been pulled apart. The frame of reference could not be completed simply, for example, with a reconstructed house. Something else was needed. The first temporal piece of heritage that these returnees restored was the feast for the Day of Elijah. Each 2nd of August, thousands of people living in the diasporas across the world would gather in Gatsko for a single day. Time and community seemed to be, if for a moment, regained. After their leaving, the few elderly people who remained scattered around the Gatsko villages would retreat into the time space of home. Their narratives were saturated with the past of the landscape, and they again waited for Elijah all year long, but this was now a double-coded waiting, a waiting to wait, a waiting to wait the way they once waited, a waiting for the time to resemble itself, its homely self. In his Waiting the Whites of South Africa, an anthropologist, Krapanzano, understood waiting as a kind of passive activity through which the waiters lose their grip on the present and have no control over the future. He noted, the world in its immediacy slips away. It is derealized. It is without elan, vitality, creative force. It is numb, muted, dead. Its only meaning lies in the future, in the arrival or the non-arrival of the object of waiting. For the most part, this is precisely what the waiting in Gatsko was not. Through it, the world was voiced, realized, enlivened, given meaning. To give up on waiting meant to give up completely. Rethinking the agency of waiting, Hassan Haj suggested that we understand it not only as passive activity, but also as active passivity. In Gatsko, the creativity of waiting lied precisely in that it worked around the impossibility of direct confrontation with the state. It was waiting as oriented endurance. In her ethnography, Ruba Salih considers the temporariness and precarity of Palestinian refugee camps that became a permanent transgenerational horizon. She thinks about the political qualities of such persistent temporariness in the struggle against the normalization of the occupation. Palestinians frequently hang on their walls the keys of the houses from which they were exiled. These keys are orientational, just like a person incarcerated in a solitary cell might count the days and the weeks by scratching tally marks into the wall. Or when Steph Janssen wrote about the temporal entrapments and the meantime of a Sarajevo suburb, he noticed that people still waited for the public buses to arrive on time, continually complaining about the disorganized post-war state and desiring the supposedly punctual Yugoslav bus arrivals. Whilst people in this suburb of Sarajevo and in Janssen's ethnography performed their desires for normal lives by waiting for the bus and the visibility of the state and the state's order, people in Gatsko waited for the feast of Elijah and the visibility of the community thus structured. Gatsko returnees seldom spoke about the war or life in exile, almost as if that period of their lives lacked language. It seemed as if their toolbox for time reckoning was not really equipped to deal with the unwanted absence of community and habitual relations. And when the war was mentioned, it somehow always came back to the encounters with the old landscape. I would spend hours hearing about the male choirs causing the village lamps to burst with their becharat tenors during the Elijah's Day festivities, the village boys lined up in makeshift dresses for their circumcision rites of passage, the seasonal succession of medicinal herbs in the field, the intricate workings of fairies and ghostly apparitions. However much the two Gotsko chronotopes worked to erase or forget each other, there were discernible moments, however, when they met. One was when the diasporic Elijah's Day visitor started to leave. Another one was revealed in loneliness. Returnees mostly lived lonely, solitary lives. And the land itself was perceived as lonely. It was unattended, desocialized, confined, and withdrawn. Here was a path towards the old tombstones on the mountain, people would tell me, but it was overgrown by brambles. Or they would say, Gurbeti used to camp there each spring, where those brambles are now. If the weeds signified an unhomely house, these shrubs, called trnje or thorns, were the image of an unhomely landscape. This land was also silent. It ceased to communicate through miraculous phenomena. It no longer yielded fairies, ghosts, or other figures with a divine connection to it. These figures, these characters were in the past, possibly also in the future, but not in the present. Given the absence of a younger generation, the transfer of memory had shifted from public performance to intimate narrative. Bodily immersion in a past landscape lingered like a phantom limb. Its sensations were relived with the excitement and texture of immediacy before regressing into the acknowledgement of loss. I was offered, in the daydreaming of the returnees, a landscape rich in encounters between people of different faiths, encounters with magical beings, encounters with animals, bodies of water, trees, and herbs, a landscape of gatherings and festivities. A sigh meant that my interlocutors had been shaken up into some sudden lucidity, and something had broken through their temporal transposition, and we were back in the now, the after the war. The absence summed up by a short lamentation, a sip of coffee, a deep pull on the cigarette, or the heaviest of silences. It was only when I started transcribing my recorded conversations that I fully understood the endings, the regressions. So I'll give you a few here. These are the endings of my conversations. It's a selection. What can you do? Where there used to be 700 households, now there are 30 souls, all old, like me. That's how it was. There was beauty. There really was. There were many things, but there you go. But now, by God, none of that exists. The villages have died out, almost completely, died out. They were beautiful traditions. Now it has all dissipated. Nobody practices them anymore. There is no life, not here. It won't. There is no life. By God, there was lots of stuff before, my son, and today it cannot be. They've taken all of this. Today, nothing can be as it was before. There are no more. There are no more fairies, no good ones, these saintly figures. There is nobody to see utvare, these ghostly apparitions, nor to experience nur, the supernatural light from the graves of the saints. These and hundreds of similar temporal adjustments were how long narratives of how it used to be usually ended. The present committed repetitive acts of violence upon the effectively returning landscape. All the endings were moments of disenchantment. In them, the field of magic beings and goodness had disappeared. The general tenor of narration would take a sharp turn from rich and vibrant descriptions, visceral and tactile reconstructions, and often laughter, towards brief, fractured, and sober realizations of an explicit loss and the usual moment of silence. Elaine Scarry has argued that physical pain might resist language, but also simultaneously shatter it by deconstructing it into the pre-language of cries and groans. This awakening silence following the narratives in Gatsko seems like a shattered language or a post-language, a bodily arrest at the overwhelmingly unnarratable, and inexpressibility marking the point where the two chronotopes face each other. Maurice Holbach's, perhaps by way of his own dealings with the war, described the root of dreamlike states or contemplative memory, a passage encountered by Gatsko returnees as well. Such a past may offer a way out of the present and is thus never free from the present. These escapes to the past, Holbach argued with regard to the elderly, are dreamlike states, even yearnings, formed by societal pressures. In contrast to the present, they appear as moments of relaxation. Episodes of temporal retreat may then be understood as a coping mechanism and a longing for home. Home in Gatsko would then be a residual past of the body that resonates through another time space. It is a lingering protrusion into the scapes of its own loss. Its phantom existence demands something through the body and from the body. Phantom limbs, Maurice Merleau-Ponty noted, often preserve and perpetuate the exact position they occupied at the time of injury. They're not lost because the remnant of the body does not cease to allow for them. This is true of the lingering Gatsko home as well, namely that to have a phantom landscape is to remain open to all the actions of which the landscape alone is capable. The past had been filtered into an unquestionable image of home. In this past, there are no significant ruptures, conflicts, or fears. The unhomely present landscape of Gatsko was seen as a shadow of its poetically homely predecessor. It no longer performed the once basic economic and social functions, and most of all, it was far from any feeling of safety. Yet, it elicited the old landscape like a fading photograph of a dead ancestor that invites a life narrative. It came alive through the past, and it withered away through the present. Looking at a photograph of his house in Bombay, Salman Rushdie wrote in his Imaginary Homelands, "The past is a foreign country," goes the famous opening sentence of L.P. Hartley's novel The Go-Between. They do things differently there. But the photograph reminds me that it's my present that is foreign and that the past is home, albeit a lost home in a lost city in the midst of lost time. The weighting of the southeastern Bosnian highlands directly confronts the continued evisceration of landscapes and the ideology of impossibility of shared interfaith lives. The project of ethnic and religious cleansing continues through the politics of schooling, healthcare, and law, as well as through the production of constant threats to the social legitimacy of those who depart in any way from the ethno-religious and territorial matrix on offer. See, for example, this version of the statement, which is constantly repeated in one form or another by a small group of nationalist politicians. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is not a single shared holiday except for New Year and the 1st of May, but those are international holidays. No common holiday shared by the three peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina is possible because they have always been on different sides of history and marked the holidays in different ways, some as victory, some as defeat. Yet, my interlocutors found it difficult to recall any popular holiday that was not common, mixed, or shared by different religious groups in one way or another, whether it was the feast of George, Elijah, John, Peter, Procopius, Demetrius, or the 1st of May, or the boundary crossing rituals for Christmas, Ramadan, and the 2 Eids, or the traditions of mutual visitations for these and other holidays, and so on. The nationalist political program in Bosnia survives by projecting well-defined ethno-religious categories and crafting the perpetual here and now of ethnic precarity. The problem is that a large portion of research conducted on Bosnia since the 90s takes the supplied political discourse at face value. The nationalist terms of art enter the common vocabulary, and the enmities are taken as a historical and anthropological starting point. I have attempted to bridge this methodological gap, this methodological trap, really, by developing a different kind of approach to Bosnian landscapes, taking the cue from one superb article by Joost Fontaine, an anthropologist based at the University of Edinburgh. Based on his research in southern Zimbabwe, he called for an anthropology of proximity. We may do better not by emphasizing radical difference, but rather by cultivating an acute sensitivity to the proximities, coexistences, and continuities that derive from people's shared material and historical engagements as a way of writing against politicized differences rather than reasserting them on ever more abstract philosophical grounds. Now, I thought this was quite a good summary of the Cambridge Interfaith program as well. Now, nurturing a methodological sensibility to encounters does not avoid acknowledging difference, distance, or conflict. Indeed, the concept of proximity depends on a certain distinction or distance, which then needs to be analytically analyzed, unpacked. My research into proximity reveals how intimacy and distance are processed by landscapes and negotiated in spaces hidden from the main political arenas. It does not only take proximity when it's harmonious, but also proximity as a tension, as you could see with the proximity between the 2 chronotopes that I described. So in a way, this is my question for all of you on the methodological challenge of an anthropology of proximity. I imagine it hasn't been easy traveling into these unknown landscapes and geographies for many of you all of a sudden. Thank you so much for listening to me. As Giles knows, we have waited for these seminars to continue for quite some time. I'm quite an impatient waiter, which is ironic because of all of this stuff about waiting and all of my writing. But I guess I should be learning from myself. Waiting keeps alive the object awaited. So it makes sense. It made sense to wait for the continuation of these seminars, and I hope you will join us for the ones to come. Thank you so much again.